As we continue in our study of diversity issues in social work practice, I want to take the time to talk some about racism and discrimination that results from the attitude of racism. As we've discussed before, race is a social construct, and it's a way of thinking about ourselves and others that is determined socially, and is the result of living in a race-conscious society. We are, in essence, taught and trained to think it's important, this concept of race, and that this is, in fact, what it is that makes race seem important in our world. But biologically, race is trivial. Racial typologies are arbitrary, ambiguous, vary from culture to culture and from community to community. The seeming importance of race in our society isn't based on biology at all, it's based on our perceptions. And racial identity, thus, is an outcome of socialization and not from one's genetic heritage. Some are familiar with the one-drop rule about race, that if a person has one non-white person in their biological heritage, even generations back, then you're not considered white by some thinkers. The sociologist Robert Merton distinguished 4 different combinations of prejudice and discrimination. This is again something that we have discussed previously, so that it is possible to carry prejudices but not to discriminate, and it's possible to be unprejudiced but to participate in discriminatory behavior, perhaps because a group you belong to or an agency that you work for or an institution that you're a part of practices discriminatory behaviors, and you don't speak up and you contribute to it, even though you don't carry the attitudes of prejudice. So Merton said that when you look at prejudice and discrimination, you should really look at the presence or absence of one or the other. Overt discrimination is more likely to occur in a social setting where acts of ethnic or racial bias are accepted or not strongly condemned. We can think about this on a community level or a social level, also think of it in terms of our society as a whole today. This is one reason why there seem to be more acts of overt rejection and discrimination today, because of the normalization of racial comments and attitudes that have existed in our society over the last few years. Cries of "go back to where you came from" certainly echo racist ideology that goes back for generations and generations. Racism can be overt, it may be covert, such as institutional racism. An example, in a study some years ago in Birmingham, Alabama, 500 black babies died each year due to poor food, shelter, and medical facilities. Overall, black women suffered the highest infant mortality rates. For black mothers in Alabama, the rate was over 13 deaths per 1,000 live births, whereas the national average was something under 6 deaths per 1,000. Incidentally, Americans' infant mortality rate is the highest among industrialized nations in the entire world. But it's even worse if you're a member of an oppressed minority population. Biological differences related to race are used to stereotype others for status assignment in our social system. This is an act of power and is one form of institutional racism. Now, distinguish racism from prejudice, as it's more of an institutional issue. It raises to the level of social structure the tendency to use superiority as a solution to the discomfort about difference. The arrangements in our society legitimize the idea of a white superior race and a minority inferiority, and this is then used to justify limits to access of power and opportunity, and oftentimes leads to those persons who are the victims of this racism being blamed for their own failures to succeed in the society. Race here is defined as the belief that the objective or alleged differences between racial groups are justification for asserting the superiority of one racial group over another. This, of course, institutionalizes stratification in our society, and it influences life for persons of color throughout American history. Institutional racism results from a system of social structures that is based upon the belief that the white racial group is superior to others in America. It is not a part of individual action, although individual action often results from institutional racism that can be seen as racist. Consider the targeting of young black males by law enforcement. While law enforcement may be able to justify on a case-by-case basis feeling threatened by the young black male at the other end of the bullet, The question is how much of that feeling of threat is based upon actual threat and how much is based upon perceptions in their own minds about the dangerousness of young black males. Also, in August of 2019, the mass shooter of the Walmart in El Paso, Texas, specifically stated that he was targeting Latinos. These are the kinds of things that grow out of a society in which racism is becoming something of a norm in our discussion on a day-to-day basis. There is erroneous cultural assumptions about people, and this is the main factor of maintaining racism in and of itself. Now, when you look at the origins of racism, there are different theories, and one micro-theory comes from the psychologist Gordon Allport, who believed that we learn racism as children. It's something that we're taught, and that by the middle of our adolescent years, we are able to turn racism on or off at will. Macro views of racism often utilize the conflict perspective that suggests that minorities are controlled by a limited number of powerful persons in society, and that those persons impose their preferences, placing restrictions that create or at least encourage conflict. An example, some years ago, I had a student in a class who was complaining about the fact that Filipino workers were being imported to work at the canneries in Kenai in the summer and excluding locals from jobs, probably because of the fact that they were working for lower wages. And he expressed some anger towards the Filipinos. I pointed out to him perhaps the anger needed to be more directed at the employer who was engaging in those employment practices rather than at the individuals who are coming here looking for a way to earn a living and have a better life, even if it was just for a short period of time. Employers are known to hire undocumented workers because they can pay lower wages and provide less positive working conditions, require longer hours, knowing that they're unlikely to complain because of their legal status. So the groups with greater wealth and power are able to use their resources to exploit those who are less well-positioned in society. Conflict theory looks at realities of wealth and power inequalities and recognizes the different racial and ethnic groups don't have equal access to scarce resources and so don't have equal opportunity to reap the benefits of society, nor do they have equal opportunity to advance in our society. It's very important for the worker, in fact, to watch the nature of his or her own power in relationship to those he is or she is working with when clients are of the minority status. Our thinking in this culture tends to be dominated by race, and in many positions, many white persons in positions of authority, including academic environments, preach that we're colorblind, but oftentimes are unaware of the advantage that their color gives them. Paulo Freire writes about this in his book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed. Personal, individual, attitudinal discrimination stems from an individual's attitudes of prejudice or acts in response to the prejudice of others. They're direct, observable, and visible. An example of this is refusing service to a person of some minority group. Institutional discrimination, which can be organizational or societal, on the other hand, includes trends that exclude minorities from equal opportunity for positions of power and prestige. These policies and practices appear to be neutral, but when you look at the impact they have upon minority populations, they become much less neutral and much more toxic. These methods of discrimination are covert, invisible, very subtle. Oftentimes they're overlooked, not even noticed. Or if they are noticed, they're excused as natural or justified or impossible to change. Some examples noted here include word-of-mouth hiring practices where individuals in an employment situation tell their friends about jobs that are opening and their friends apply, and this tends to restrict outside applicants from being able to be hired in this situation and therefore oftentimes excludes minorities. Jury selection from registered voter pools when we know of the restrictions that are placed on voting registration from one community to another, from one state to another. Photo ID requirements, one source of concern about that these days. Those photo IDs, the transportation to get to where the photo IDs are made and the funds to pay for the photo IDs are much more limited for persons of oppressed status in this society. As your city commission selection at large or district by district, because those that are representative of the district oftentimes limit the power of minority populations because of the way those district lines are drawn. Gerrymandering occurs on a local level as well as a state level as well, and affects who gets elected. Punishments for crack and powdered cocaine varied very differently. I believe this is actually being corrected now, but in the past has been an issue where the punishment for possession and use of crack cocaine was much more severe than that of powdered cocaine. And of course, individuals who were in the middle and upper classes were more inclined to use powdered cocaine than they were to use crack cocaine, which was more popular among those who couldn't afford powdered cocaine. How are your schools funded? Read the article by Jonathan Kozol. I believe it's in your assignments link called Savage Inequalities, and it shows the problems that are set up by inadequate property tax bases in poor neighborhoods and how this results in limited educational opportunities for youth who grow up in that kind of environment. These things are seen as just naturally occurring, justified as something that can't be changed, when indeed they must be changed. Individuals believe it's important to look, rather than looking at the motivations of the majority group and implementing discriminatory practices, it's really more important to consider the effect or the practice on the minority group. So that the debate oftentimes is the majority isn't intending to limit, and there's no intention in the policy to limit minorities. But when you look at the statistics, when you look at the actual facts, the effect of these policies and these practices are very devastating on a minority group. And so focusing upon the effect rather than the motivations of the groups or the institutions may be a more effective way of challenging institutional discrimination. Now, you have an article by David Oppenheimer that you've been assigned to read on the different models of affirmative action. The discussion about affirmative action often involves one thing, which is hiring quotas and admission quotas, which are, since the Bakke decision in the 1980s, deemed to be illegal in our society. But there are other ways, other forms of affirmative action, the four other models that are listed here, that are legal and can be quite effective in trying to level the playing field and providing equity in hiring and admissions. Universities, employers can use a race or gender conscious model of hiring and recruitment that is flexible enough that it can still target to attract minority applicants, to improve the educational environment on the campus, or to diversify their workforce. But it still allows for the admission of unusual white applicants, even in those spots that might otherwise be targeted for minority populations. So those are legal affirmative action procedures. And there's other models here that suggest how employers can set timelines and tables to increase the amount of minority employees, for instance, or minority admissions to reflect the population of the community or of the society, that efforts to reach out into minority neighborhoods to work against the word-of-mouth hiring and advertise the availability of work for qualified applicants, and the non-discrimination model, which involves employers teaching their employees how to avoid discriminating. These are all legitimate forms of affirmative action and continue to be very necessary in our society. Many persons in oppressed racial groups find it very hard to imagine that the American dream is ever going to be made available to them. Look at some statistics involving African Americans, for instance. While their jobless rates have declined in recent times, they continue to be more than twice as likely to be unemployed as whites. And they are disproportionately represented among the homeless and among the incarcerated. We will be talking about that later in the semester. African American children are disproportionately represented in foster care in the United States and disproportionately supervised by the child welfare system. And these phenomena, including the disproportionality of children in the child welfare system and in foster care, are replicated in Alaska for Alaska Natives as well. Education is touted as being the means of achieving economic success and improving one's circumstances in our society. But there are some statistics that are worth considering in that light. For instance, the high school graduation rate averages about 85% nationally. This was a few years ago, but broken down by race, you can see that some of the minority populations in America do more poorly than others. The Asian and Pacific Islander group, now this is a blending of many different cultures, and just like the Hispanic and African American for that matter, are many different cultures blended into one aggregate group. And so don't draw overgeneralizations based on this, but Asian Americans, oftentimes Asian cultures place a great value on a high value on education. And so this has something to do with the success in the educational environment for them. On the university level, we're looking here at students who have graduated from their original four-year institution within 4 to 6 years. Once again, you can see quite a disparity among the minority groups as opposed to the white and Asian American students here. Most notably, the American Indian and Alaska Native students, where only 39% of those were able to graduate. Now, there are many ways of explaining this, but again, thinking in terms of institutional discrimination, admission policies, and also what comes before college education. What kind of preparation do minority students and lower income students, which generally are populated percentage-wise with more minority individuals, what's the quality of the preparation those individuals get for higher education as opposed to the quality of education that white middle-class students and upper-class students would be getting? This is where you have to look before the college experience to understand why these statistics are as they are. You also note here that among Black and African American students that there's a difference also in the success rate of Black women graduating as opposed to Black males. George Appleby and others write another textbook on diversity that I've worked out of, and they say they believe it's not individuals who create racial categories, but rather micro-level practices in social institutions. There are theorists such as Oliver Cromwell Cox who believe that people of color are doubly exploited in a capitalist economy, both as members of the working class and as persons who are seen as inferior to workers who are white. They earn less, and they are less likely to be hired. Cox believed that the core of the racial problem in the United States was that blacks wished to assimilate through obtaining equal opportunity and improving their life through a reduction in illness and lower unemployment, less crime, illiteracy, but that the white ruling class is strongly opposed to their assimilation, believing it's advantageous to keep blacks and other persons of color, for that matter, in an underprivileged status, advantageous economically, politically, and socially. It's important for workers, again, to assess their own culture and their own ethnic identity and its implications when working with diverse populations. Richard Dyer wrote an article called The Need to Understand Whiteness. He's an English academic who has studied gender and sexuality and race largely in film and media. And he says that as long as race is something that's only applied to non-white peoples, as long as white people are not racially seen and named, they or we function as a human norm. Other people are raced, we're just people. It's an interesting phenomenon because many white persons don't consider race to be an issue for them because they're white, and that race only applies to minorities. So white social workers need to practice from a theory that recognizes how people of color are vulnerable in our society and are highly subject to victimization in this society. This society places very little true value on diversity, even though we claim to be a melting pot who values multiculturalism. Our society deliberately sets traps and loves to keep persons of color subordinate, but people of color must also be adept at avoiding the pitfalls that are set by such a society. So this means that not only do we address the discrimination that exists in our society at an institutional level and challenge that discrimination on a macro level, but we also help individuals that we come into contact with on a micro level to develop the skills, the knowledge, the confidence necessary to avoid pitfalls and challenge that discrimination individually as well. So this idea that somehow white people aren't raced puts us in this position of being the essence of what it means to be human and speaking for all of humanity, while those in other groups only speak for their own race. Dyer says that whites aren't of a certain race, they're just the human race, he says, and he believes that we need to see our whiteness as others see their skin color, because otherwise it's just normal, and we become the yardstick against which all other races are measured. Dyer believes whiteness needs to be made strange. It's an interesting thought to leave you with, and I hope that this provides some fodder for your own thought and for perhaps some conversation in one of our meetings later in the semester. Thank you.